Hello and welcome everybody, it's Peter Downs here. Welcome to the webinar, Getting Your House in Order, Organisational Development Models That Work. I can tell you I've got about 41 people online right now for this particular webinar. We should go for about an hour or so for this webinar, so hang in there until the end. We've got a lot of content to get through. I'll be hosting today's webinar. I've also have with me Paul Grogan from MDO Consulting and Brendan Lynch from Export, who are our resident panelists and experts today, who you'll be hearing most from. My role is to simply act as your host and guide the webinar through to its conclusion. I'm from the Inclusion Club here in iwebinar.com.au, and to make sure that we address some of your questions as we go, and we keep on time. So I'm the host. We also have Paul Grogan from MDO Consulting, which we'll be hearing from in just a second, and also Brendan Lynch from Export as well. And you'll be hearing from Brendan just shortly. But first of all, we do have a lot of content to get through, so I want to hand over immediately to Paul Grogan, who will do a very, very quick introduction to himself and then get straight into the content of this particular webinar.
Thanks, Peter. And good afternoon, everyone. One of the issues with governance or with organisational models is that it's very easy to basically get people gun shy, to make them feel, oh, it's too hard. There is just too much information. And if you actually go onto Google, and I did a screenshot here where I typed in governance, and it came up with 145 million results. And when you look at that, is it any wonder that when people think about governance, they start to become a bit despondent and it's all too hard? So, excuse my croaky voice. So the idea is, how do we dispel that idea that it is too big, too hard? And it's one of the issues that we contend with, or I've found in the consultancy, is people tend to have an iceberg perspective, that they know a little bit about governance, but they assume that there's this massive amount underneath that they've got to be competent with if they're going to be effective in this space. And what I would say to them is, no, it's really not that hard. And so from that perspective, what we try and talk about are what are the things which need to be in place to affect decent, effective, or good outcomes in the governance and management of your organisation. Excuse me. Go back a little bit in history, and we go back to what most of the sports are in Australia, and those are federated models of governance. We know that there are the unitary models and other sort of variations, but generally in the sports sector, the federated model, and also in the broader not-for-profit, tends to be the dominant model. And if we go back even further, we go back to the Australian Federation Conference in Melbourne back in 1890, and Alfred Deakin, in one of his opening speeches, and I asked the question, how likely is it that his opening line was, let's establish a federation to tell us what to do? I'd suggest the answer is no. The idea was that it was creating a federation to do that which the individual states couldn't do on their own. So it was about a collective benefit, a collective good. I thought this was a rather amusing extract. It says, his, obviously referring to Alfred Deakin, his was the only memorable speech at the conference, which was also noteworthy for the extraordinary level of antagonism between the colonies, namely New South Wales and Victoria, who rarely agreed on a single issue. And to that end, I don't suppose that has come as much of a surprise. Factionalism and that sort of conflict, I think, has been around for a long time. But one of the important statements that did come out of that particular time was, what are the aims of a federated model? And they said that the object in view has been to put principles before the public rather than details, because the subject itself is new to most of us, and unless principles are grasped, it may not be easy to arrange the compromises on which all federations are founded. Now, that's a statement from 1891, and I'd argue that in 2013, it is still as valid as it was then. We need to focus on the principles and then lead to what are the compromises that as members of this organisation we need to accept for the greater good. Okay, what is good governance? They don't talk about best practice, we talk about good governance. And what I propose is that good governance is the coming together, the bridging of the gap between the legal requirements or fiduciary responsibilities that one has as a director, and on the right-hand side, all of the better practice or good governance things that a well-run, effective organisation would have in place. So the aim is to try and create a little bit of harmony in bringing those two sides of the equation together. Pardon me. When I'm working with boards, I normally talk about there are 7 major responsibilities for a board. The first of those is to get their structures right, then get their strategic direction right, then to look at the processes and their risk management of how well they work together. And I think that image is very telling in the fact that while they're individuals, they are one single entity, one brain, one leadership group. And we'll talk a little bit more about board solidarity in a moment. The next is how they direct the activity and or the CEO, if they do have a CEO in place. It's basically the management component. Excuse the phone there for a moment. The next major thing that a board needs to do is to monitor the organisation. How effectively do you have systems and processes in place to know what's happening and whether or not you're on track or off track? This brings us then to reporting to members and stakeholders. And the final one, which I think is very, very topical at the moment, is the board needs to take responsibility for the culture of the organisation. Now, this webinar today is we're going to be talking just about the first 2 elements, the structure and the strategy. We're proposing a second one to talk about processes and directing the activity, and a third one which will talk about the monitoring, reporting and culture. So I'll soldier on. So in that first one, looking at the structures, we talk about a number of types of structures. The first is the governance and board structure, which falls out of the Constitution. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Constitution in the next slide. But effectively, is the Constitution a modern enabling document? And in many cases, sadly, they're not. Are the board of directors established and structured in such a way that they are effective governors, and are they leading the organisation appropriately? And to that end, I'll throw this curveball in there that a council is now, I would argue, an archaic construct in most modern organisations, and it is a hangover from a previous paradigm. So it's a very topical one, and I can hear a few people gnashing their teeth, but it's for another day. But certainly the issue of councils is one that needs to be reconciled. We then look at the membership structure and whether or not it's structured for the future, structured for success, and also whether or not it's fair and equitable. So there aren't things like proportional voting and other things. This then brings us to the management structure and looking at the way that the board and the CEO, if you have them, or if your committees and volunteers, how well they all fit together. And I can hear a few people probably saying, but hang on, doesn't structure follow strategy? And it's a good question. And where I'm coming from here is that I would argue that your legal and governance structures come first. You then establish your strategy and then move into the management structure, which enables you to deliver on those objectives. So that's sort of the basis of where I'm coming from. Okay, board of directors, and this is a topical one when you're looking at the variety of organisations and the size that we have in the not-for-profit, and particularly in the sports sector, is what's the difference between a board of directors and a management committee? And somewhere in between, and it's a fairly rough rule of thumb, but generally what I would say is you're a board of directors and acting as governors when you have paid staff that you can delegate the management responsibility to. Where you don't have that, you have this split role where you still have the same legal responsibilities as governors of a board, but you also then have to roll your sleeves up and get out there and actually make things happen. It's probably a whole other workshop to look at what are the strategies and practical application of those two different models, but it's just be conscious of when you're working with organisations that they will be somewhere along that continuum.